episode?
It's number
Three?
four. Number four.
Wow.
Not many people have gotten to four. It might just be you and Madeline. It might just be Madeline. Hello and welcome to Required Reading, the podcast that revisits the most impactful book from our childhood. I'm your host, Erin Bowles. I'm a writer, actor, and comedian. And we've got another four-timer. We've got returning again, Jess Woodworth. Hi! We are doing Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and I wanted to start recording as soon as possible so I could get this on the mic. I wanted to do this book because there's an adaptation of it that was very big in my childhood. And I was talking to our mutual friend, Madeline North, and just saying like, oh, I want to do Alice in Wonderland at some point. And she goes, what are you doing talking to anyone else besides Jess? You must. And I was like, you know what? I'm being a doof. Yes, I must. And here we are.
It is right there in my username.
It's literally Cheshire Theory. Yes. So here we are. So tell me, what's your backstory with this book? How did it come into your life?
It actually totally started, and I have to give credit where credit is due, with the Disney adaptation.
Yeah. Which one?
And the original animated one.
Yes.
I was obsessed with it as a child. I had it on repeat. I watched it all the time. I found it both incredibly delightful and the right amount of spooky for my little brain. And over time, I realized I was probably 14 the first time I read the book, which is actually kind of late. But I just didn't really have it on my radar as a book. And I think I also didn't fully comprehend how much of a tiny little short book it was, but I had it in my zeitgeist for much longer than that, just because of, like I said, Disney. And then also my grandparents, I believe, told me about it. Didn't read it to me, but told me about it, told me that I should read it, that type of thing. And so it, like I said, I was probably 14 the first time I read it, and I was absolutely obsessed with it off the jump. As a writer, I find it really delightful when books do things that are unexpected or different or not really replicated that often. And Alice is one of the first times where I was like, oh wow, you really can write about whatever the heck you want.
Yeah.
I remember being very, very interested in how the storytelling existed, because when I first picked it up, I remember being well, there must be so much more that ties all of these bits and bobs together from this Alice in Wonderland movie. And so I pick up the book, I read it, and I was like, actually, I think that the movie streamlined half of it.
Yeah.
I was delighted by its wordplay, delighted by its quirky characters, and it's just been something that's really stuck with me my whole life as a work of fiction that has followed me around and meant a whole bunch to me. I think that this book is often overlooked. I think that most people know the story, but they haven't read the book.
Yeah, definitely.
So yeah, I find it really just to be a great. I feel like it's a masterclass in wordplay and also how you can make something both filled with childlike wonder and also not particularly difficult to understand, while also being grander and larger than life and having these very philosophical things that are being asked in the midst of a children's book.
Yeah, this is my first time reading it, despite, obviously, the movie we were talking about in the 50s and 60s. The Tim Burton one came out when we were both in middle school-ish, so that was prevalent. I wanted to do this because I was a huge fan of The Looking Glass Wars by Frank Bador, which we will do an episode. I've been posting about it online, and not a soul has even liked it. Even liked the post. So we'll get there one day. But I think what makes you want to come back to it every time? Do you feel like you find something new in it, or is it just that wonder of it all?
If we're talking the first couple times I read it, it definitely was much more in the vein of finding something new. I have a handful of copies I have one that is connected with Through the Looking Glass and what she found there. I have one that's so thick. Actually, a gift from Madeline. It's a beautiful book, but it's, I don't know, probably like 600 pages of like, it's literally Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and other stories, which I think is Through the Looking Glass, the original Alice in Wonderland, like that he told to Alice Little. And one of his other books that isn't necessarily like connected to Alice, but is very much in the vein of like the Wonderland universe, something about the Snark. So that I have that also. And so I think that initially especially being like I said, much younger when I first read it, I think I got a very surface level kind of appreciation for it that first time. And the more that I came back to it, the more I was like, oh my gosh, this is wordplay, or oh my gosh, this is like a callback to this moment, or this is how, like, even just like looking at it with the other works that have inspired it, like how those things have been picked apart and put together. And then, of course, getting these newer copies that have a lot of extra information inside of them was devourable to me. I thought it was just the coolest thing to be able to learn more about, like, this time of writing that is kind of, like, mystical to me in its own right, you know, like, that, like, writers wrote in such a different way. There's a lot of, like, appreciation for that and, like, things of the time. Now, in my 30s, I think it's more so just like a comfort novel. I pick it up every now and then because it's easy to sit down and get through. And I still find myself appreciating the storytelling of it. And, like, for those who haven't read it but have seen the animated Disney adaptation, when I say it's extremely similar, I really do mean it. Because it is written like a dream sequence.
Yeah.
And I find so much joy in how well it depicts a dream-like existence. This idea of being yourself but not yourself, and all of these strange things happening, but also not really finding them strange. Like, for as much as you're like, huh, that's interesting, or ooh, that's odd, you aren't, like, ever questioning the reality, you know? And Alice does that throughout the whole novel, of just, like, kind of wading through all of these different things that she's brought to. And I feel like you could argue that she is a very, like, passive protagonist. A lot of things happen to her.
Yeah.
But I don't find it to be poor writing, you know? Like, there's a lot of enjoyment in coming back and re-experiencing Alice's adventures through Alice's very inquisitive young brain. And I think I relate to that idea of questioning things and not always getting the answers, you know, being met with, you know, being brushed off or being misunderstood, or trying your best to make yourself clear and still it coming out all wrong. I always find myself coming back and re-enjoying that feeling of going back into a dream-like sequence and that childlike wonder, like I said.
Yeah, I think that I also came away with the sort of passive protagonist thing, and then I also said, I sort of challenged myself of like, okay, get a new idea. Like, try a little harder, engage with it a little more earnestly and sincerely. And there is something very interesting about Alice because, like you said, she barely questions, but she does really roll with the punches, and there is kind of a real talent to her just being like, okay, this is what it is, here we go, and just kind of, like you said, being in awe of all of it.
Yeah, it really feels like a child, right?
Yes.
Like, you are told one thing and you just kind of accept it, but you still internally question it. And I love her internal questions that she never really voices out loud, because it feels so childlike to me that, like, oh, I guess that's the way it is.
Yeah.
I didn't think that was the way it was, but okay, that's the way it is.
Yeah, there's a great moment that I loved when she is getting really big for, maybe the first time. And instead of questioning, like, how am I getting big? She's like, oh, I can't see my shoes anymore. They're gonna get upset if I don't talk to them. I need to buy them nice boots for Christmas so they still like me. And I was like, there's this capability of, like, she is really thinking things out. But part of why I really wanted to talk to you about this is because you mentioned Alice Little. It feels like there is so much sort of mystery backstory around this book that I felt like I kind of wanted to talk to, my local expert about. And also how much of it is this is sort of a nonsense book and really trying to, like, apply logic and history and reason. I definitely want to talk later in comparison to Wizard of Oz, which of course is, like, my core text and are so similar.
Yes, I agree. What's fascinating to me about Lewis Carroll specifically is he had a stutter. Mm-hmm. So I think that this wordplay that you find in a lot of his books is almost like taking back that control. But yes, he had a super unique relationship with Alice Little, a little girl who lived basically down the street from him. There's, plenty of question about what their relationship was, if it was appropriate, if it wasn't appropriate. But the main takeaway that I understand about it, because there really isn't a lot of documentation about, like, if there was anything that was more malicious about their friendship, or if it really was this man who found wonder in the children and was just this artsy kind of introvert that found himself able to connect with children because of that stutter. Children don't judge you if you can't get the words out right away. When you think about it through the lens of him being able to connect with this child in a way that, like, adults, especially of the time, were unwilling to listen or like I said, even just baseline interact with, him having that ability to tell these stories to a little girl as this captive audience, despite whatever he was overcoming in those moments, I think was very empowering for him and probably aided a lot in their friendship.
And he's also this, like, incredible mathematician. There's this anecdote of Queen Victoria, and maybe it's all apocryphal, but that Queen Victoria loved Alice in Wonderland and said, send me his next book, and it's some incredibly complex treatise on mathematics or something like that. But yeah, like you said, like, I did a little bit of reading. I think I listened to an episode of a podcast, I think it's called Betwixt the Sheets, which was a lot of not necessarily debunking, but it's like you said, like, we just don't really have enough to make these huge claims. So maybe, like, we just engage with what we have and hope for the best. Because in comparison, this is 1864, 35 years later, you have Wizard of Oz, and obviously that's an American text, but with that, L. Frank Baum is, like, writing for his grandkids. He is just really, and you see in the introductions to later books, he is just like, what can I do to make kids happy and imaginative? And I think, like, that is not satisfying to an adult audience, but ultimately, like, you're not the audience, bro. It's not for you.
Exactly. If you aren't experiencing the wonder, you weren't the target audience to begin with.
Yeah, I think, like, and I do have want to ask you about this, because there's this, a lot of people want to look at the Wizard of Oz and say, like, oh, the Yellow Brick Road is, or means X, like, people say it's the gold standard, and that this is that, and this is that, and that's bunk. But we do, like, there is a very interesting element of, like, well, obviously, the meaning that an audience applies becomes part of the narrative. It grows with the narrative. Like, that's part of why it sticks around. So even if that's not an authorial intent, it does apply. But I've heard people saying, this is skewering this and that, and this is what this is about. I wonder if is there any of that is genuine, or is, if there is a there.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think that there are moments in the text. I would argue you can maybe make a different argument for Through the Looking Glass, but especially in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and if you're just looking at this first text, I think a lot of it really is this drifting dreamlike sequence. And I mean, of course you can look at the fact that like they do have very real wordplay poems and verses that are rearranged and torn apart and made into what is considered quote unquote nonsense by Alice, and honestly even some of the people of Wonderland, creatures of Wonderland, where they tell her that the verse is wrong but she can't quite remember. And in moments like that, I think it is much more, again, a text that is supposed to connect to a child.
Yeah.
And what I get from those moments is that we do know that she's sitting listening to her sister drow on about lessons.
Yeah.
And so I more so find that those moments, for me, they connect to this, again, this dreamlike sequence of like, you know, something passively is happening in the real world that is allowing Alice to kind of work through these lessons and these difficulties and these confusions. But again, tainted with this different, colorful, new lens that is both, again, very exciting, I think, but to her is also very alarming. I think for me, the story feels much more about a girl finding her authority and belief, you know, and finding her voice and finding who she wants to be in this world. You know, by the end of the book, Alice actually gains some urgency about how she plans to basically interact with the scariest person in Wonderland. And so I think when you look at it like as a full text, there is a lot of things that could allegorically be relevant to the times, but I don't think there's a much deeper meaning other than being connective tissue for Alice Little. I think that they were really just supposed to make her feel seen and heard in the same way that like she was doing for him.
Yeah.
There's a part where they're talking to the March Hare and they mention March 4th. And March 4th is Alice Little's birthday.
Oh.
And I think that is a really, like, telling for how this whole story was crafted, is it really was focused on making this little girl feel special. Like, it was her adventures that he really wanted to capture, and her wonder that he wanted to capture. And so, do I believe that there is potentially, like, political things or even some more like quiet references that at the time maybe were referencing like, oh, who is the mock turtle or the griffin representing, or are they just a mock turtle and a griffin? I think we could get into that forever, but I think that there is a lot of reality that it was really just so that Alice could feel like it was more real and more hers, you know.
Yeah, there's a little introduction in my very old copy that is talking about the moment on the river, and the introduction is titled How the Story Was Told, and that the names in one section are, playing on the names of the people. So, like, Dodgson becomes the Dodo, and the sister Lorena becomes the Lori, and all of these things. And so I think, like you're saying, in that way, it is so special. And I loved what you said about, because it is very easy to say passive protagonist, all of this stuff, but by the end, when she is there with the Queen of Hearts and there's this big trial, she is really, I loved how you said it, she is stepping into her own authority, and she is able to say, no, this is nonsense, this doesn't make sense, and I do not have to tolerate it. And I think there's a very wonderful aspect of this book that is like affirming that, like, sometimes adults don't make sense, and sometimes the world you are in doesn't make sense, and so many of the books that last through childhood and persist with us are the ones that say, yeah, the grown-ups don't know what they're doing, and certainly as you get older, they don't, we're all pretending.
It's such a core part of this novel, this idea of when you question things, you're also told you're stupid. She's told that she's an idiot numerous times in this book, and internally she knows she's not stupid. She knows that she is a very smart child, and in her darkest moments of doubt, she feels like she doesn't know who she is, and she's like, well, maybe I've become somebody who's less smart, maybe I am more dumb than I was yesterday. because I can't say the words right, and I can't do the things right, and I don't know what's happening. But I think that somewhere in her, she also knows that it all is silly and nonsense and made up, and that the rules are constantly changing, it seems. And so, who's to say in a world where you're growing larger and smaller, and there's talking dodo birds, and there's lobster quadrilles, like, who's to say what is the most true thing and the most, like, correct thing? This idea of, like, children watching as adults try to be adults is, I think, a core theme of, like, even the Red Queen boiling everything down to just a simple, everyone will be punished. Anyone who goes against what I say will be punished. And I think we all know, whether we personally know or have a friend who experienced or whatever, we do know a parent who was like that. Don't talk to me.
Because I say so. Exactly.
I said so. It feels very Matilda to me. I'm big, you're little. I'm smart, you're dumb.
Exactly. I loved within that moment, and I feel like I don't see the King of Hearts in most adaptations, and something I really loved is Alice doesn't really seem to, like, through most of it, doesn't really seem to be afraid of danger, at least in how I read it. And one thing I loved is that, she's saying off with their heads, and then the king, like, pulls everyone aside and is like, you're pardoned, don't worry about it.
You're all pardoned.
And I was like, what a good husband, or something. And I don't know. I was like, yeah, man. And I loved that Alice is let in on that. We know that as the audience. And I think, like, obviously comparing it to Wizard of Oz, like, the fears in that seem very, very real. And so I think it is really nice to have that in comparison here of, like, what if we can do it all? And what if, I think there is something within it that it's just like, sit down at that computer and just, imagine and dream and go big and bigger and bigger. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think to your point about danger, too, we see this in the adaptations, I think, too.
Yeah.
In Burton's, he had to borrow so much from Through the Looking Glass. Mm-hmm. Like, the Jabberwocky is not in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And even in the Disney version, she recites the Jabberwocky. I think the Cheshire Cat does the story of the Jabberwocky while they're in, like, the Lost Forest, and that's her darkest moment in the Disney adaptation, where she's all alone and she says to herself, "Then I usually give myself very good advice, but I very seldom follow it," which is from much earlier in the novel. And I think that it's interesting how adaptations have had to kind of rewire or move around all of these kind of plot points, or add plot points from further text, because there isn't a lot of real, tangible fear.
Yeah. You can hear the studio exec being like, we need bigger stakes. We need, more danger, more urgency. Absolutely. Do you have, like, a favorite episode, or, because it is episodic, like, obviously the Odyssey just came out, and I'm comparing it a lot mentally to that. And your handle is, of course, Cheshire Theory. Yeah. Talk about those things. Go.
So I obviously am absolutely obsessed when we're introduced to the Cheshire Cat. I find him to be the most endearing character. But I've always really resonated with the this or that. The Gemini in me is very, very pleased by there's not really a wrong answer so much as an answer. And I think that the Cheshire Cat is often kind of depicted in most adaptations as more villainous than the book. In the book, you find that, like, the cat is one of the only characters that Alice is fond of. Mm-hmm. In a true fondness way. Doesn't find him to be nearly as unsettling as she does, like, the Duchess, or as off-putting as the pig, or the Hatter and the Hare, even, who all make her much more uncomfortable than this disappearing cat. She's more fascinated with the Cheshire Cat and his smile and his words, and she finds him to be more just like a fascinating thing. I've never knew that a cat could smile. I never have seen a smile without a cat. All of these things that are much more inquisitive than they are put off by. So when he's introduced, I think that I always get excited for that part of the book, because I also do feel like that's one of the moments where Alice starts to really gain some amount of footing in Wonderland. I don't know if it's the way that he explains things and, goes about being like, it doesn't really matter which way you want to go, because if you don't know where you're going, then it doesn't really matter. Yeah. You're going to get wherever you're going eventually, because that's the nature of the thing. I think it's in that moment where Alice starts to almost accept that, like, there is no right answer. She sort of lets go of this idea of, it's this or that. The black and white thinking kind of starts to muddle right around there. She also, I think, finds him to be very, almost mythical, is how I, view him. I feel like he is very magical. And obviously you could argue that a lot of things in Alice feel magical, but something about him, he has otherworldliness that the other characters, despite being creatures or oddities, he is almost beyond that because of his disappearing powers.
Exactly. It's like the other people, other entities don't really have powers. I 100% get what you're saying, yeah.
So, like, when he appears at the croquet match and the king is put off by him, which I find interesting, because, like you said, the king is, for the better part of the book, very kind to everyone. He's just kind of trying to, like, appease his wife quietly in the background.
Yeah.
But he does have a very, like, opinionated stance on the cat. He is, like, put off by the cat. And he actually, calls his wife over and is like, do something about this.
Yeah.
Which I also find to be very funny because of, like, especially from that time, having a man who was so subservient to his wife was just not a common trope that you really saw.
Yeah, and it's Victorian era. Yeah.
Idea that he is like this, tiny little, like, oh, my darling, do something about it. Do something. Like, he's so, like, skeeved out. But the moment where, Alice comes back and notices that they're all arguing about what to do about the cat, because he doesn't have a neck. So how are you supposed to behead him? Because he already is just a head.
Yeah.
And this argument of, like, that's just ensuing around this mythical entity that, like, nobody can really wrap their brain around. I love that moment in particular because Alice seems to be able to wrap her brain around him the most, despite not being able to wrap her brain around much going on in Wonderland. And it's everyone else in Wonderland who finds him to be, like I said, off-putting or strange or hard to understand, or what do we do about this? And again, I think it goes back to this idea that, like, they have some amount of kindredship that you don't really see in the adaptations. And I'm always so curious about what the Cheshire Cat is representative of, if it is just that's Dinah, that's a Dinah like moment, because we obviously hear so much about Alice's cat throughout the book. And so, like, one, we know she really likes cats. She finds them to be very smart. She finds them relatable, so there's already that level of, like, comfort there. But I find the moment with the Duchess to be really interesting also, because of the way that, like, because that's really where the cat is introduced. And we don't have the Duchess in many.
Right.
I actually, small aside, I actually did a musical production of Alice in Wonderland in high school, and I played the Cheshire Cat. And it was probably the most true to the book that I've ever experienced. We had a Duchess, a lot of the lines were similar, we had footmen, and I remember being so pleased about this whole entire play because of the fact it really captured I think, the essence of all of the characters very, very well. And the Duchess I always find to be so interesting because she's often shoved into the Red Queen in all of our adaptations. Like, there's almost like a muddling of these
like
two
a
characters.
combination, yeah.
It's just like these two women are similar enough. I find them to be so incredibly different. Really, really showing of the sort of two different authoritarian women that are around in probably, especially Victorian ages, like you said, a little girl's life. Somebody who is extremely strict and is going to be like sending you away, don't question me, versus this other female figure that is willing to let you say basically anything and to give you a moral behind that. Yes, you're so correct, but that means this. And I think she is such a great character to introduce the Cheshire Cat as just like that's a Cheshire Cat, that's what they do. And it's just, again, another thing where we're told, yep, that's just the way it is. And it isn't until later at Croquet and the Duchess is away from all the pepper that she has all of these nicer, more biddable reactions to Alice.
Yeah. And that's so nice, pulling back a step for the Duchess to be like applying these morals and these ideas and these messages. And we know they're all kind of nonsense. They don't really make sense at all. But it feels so right with how people now, like especially adults, approach the text and trying to find that meaning. Yeah. But I also had a question, which perhaps is very stupid. What is Cheshire? What is this adjective? I don't know what that means.
Cheshire is a place.
Oh.
So it's a place in England. And so it's like a little town. Mm-hmm. And I believe that that's quite literally the only reference point for it, is that it is a cat from this place.
Wow.
And so now, obviously, when we hear Cheshire, at least especially Americans, right, we're going to pull up the Cheshire Cat. But yeah, I'm sure if you do have any UK listeners right now, they would know of Cheshire. I'm pretty sure it's a pretty small town still, but I'm sure it was even smaller back then. And so I think it's probably another reference that Alice Little could grasp onto, but also, again, this otherworldly place, this place that is far off and distant, much like Wonderland.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I think besides the 1960-ish, Disney animated version, do you have another, and besides this high school play that you did, which is so cool that it's this homegrown thing that you got to participate in, do you have any other favorite adaptations?
There is a black and white version of Alice in Wonderland that is horrifyingly haunting. Like, the White Rabbit is in a full bodysuit, kind of like horrifyingly haunting. And I find it very endearing.
Is it silent? I'm gonna pull up my Letterboxd because I'm remembering I'm half or like a third remembering a foreign film that I saw. Please continue.
It's mostly music. Mostly music. I don't believe it's totally silent. Oh, it's been a second since I've sat down to watch it.
Yeah.
I usually have it on actually like just as like a visualizer for things, if I'm being super honest. But I do have a special place in my heart for it. For how creepy and unsettling it is. I don't think it's particularly very good. But, for what they were working with at the time. I find it to be a very endearing adaptation.
There is a Czech film from '88 called Alice that I remember very little of, but I gave it 5 stars, and my review is Alice is about to murder a man, and I love that. So that's an incentive to rewatch that.
There's also, I think it's a Through the Looking Glass adaptation, to be also very creepy, also very cool, was not well received at all.
Yeah.
But I don't mind. This always shocks people. I don't mind the Burton version. I don't mind the Burton adaptation. It came out, I think it was high school for me, early high school.
Yeah.
I think it's 2010. So I think at that point I especially was fiending for any kind of modern adaptation that was truly Alice. And at the time I was a Burton head, so it was like, oh, this will be so great. And I remember watching it and finding a lot of it to be enjoyable for how little it actually interacted with the text.
My memory of that is that the color palette and all of it, and I'm not a Johnny Depp fan even before his poor bit. It's so cold. Yeah.
It's so blue. Everything is blue. And I think what I appreciated about it is that it knew that the stakes of Alice in Wonderland, the novel, weren't grand enough, especially for a teenager. Because what we know in Burton's version is that she is about to be married off. So she's 16 or 18, something like that.
Which is a nice addition and twist. I don't hate that either, yeah.
And so what we do learn is, spoilers for anybody who hasn't seen Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland 16 years later, but we find out that when she's talking to the Cheshire Cat, there's a whole running through line in that movie where they're basically like, you're the wrong Alice. Are you the Alice? The Alice? And so what we find out is that she's been having these quote-unquote nightmares her whole life. It's actually how the movie starts, is that we meet her father, and she comes downstairs as a little girl, and he's like, the nightmares again? And she nods, and like then we're transported to her as a teenager. Her father has died off at sea, and she's being married off. And so what we find out is that what we understand to be Alice's adventures in Wonderland happened when she was a little girl. So, like, we see very briefly her painting the roses red. Like, we hear, like, you know, the off with her head. We see some amount of inkling that, like, okay, she did this before when she was a little girl. But now as an adult, she looks back at it and she's like, those were all dreams. Those are all nonsense. I don't really know what's happening. And so Alice's trajectory throughout the Burton movie is much more about reconnecting with her childhood self and her father and regaining what they call her muchness, which is something that is a reference to the text from the March Hare and the Mad Hatter when they're talking about things that start with the letter M. I think actually it's a Dormouse line. But they talk about muchness, M for muchness. Have you ever met someone with, you know, muchness, etc., etc.? And so that idea of muchness comes kind of full circle in that movie in a way I appreciate.
Yeah, talking about it, I'm getting a much greater appreciation than I did certainly then.
I think that the reason it was panned by most people is because if you really are only looking at it through the lens of like, well, this isn't a very good Alice in Wonderland, it's not. But I don't think it was intended to be so much as it's intended to be for the kids who were about that age when they were watching it, which I was.
Right.
I was about, you know, the new Alice's age. And I think knowing that it was made for me, you know, like, and people that, you know, loved that text but wanted something darker and grander and bigger, I appreciate it for what it does. I appreciate the attempts it makes to stay earnest to the world and to the text. And I mean, it's a far better adaptation of Through the Looking Glass, if we're being honest, which is why I was so shocked when we got a Through the Looking Glass movie. That movie's bad. That movie is really bad. I don't have a lot of redeeming things to say about that one. But I do find the Burton's 2010 Alice to be better than I think most people panned it to be. But you have to really appreciate what it's trying to do and understand that it's going to fail in some areas. I also really appreciated the way that they used CGI. I don't necessarily love the bloodhound or the horse, but I also understand like making them CGI so that they talk.
Yeah.
We do get a knave of hearts in that adaptation, and they do reference the king. They do reference that she beheaded the king, and they pan over to the sludge pit where his head is. I think the only adaptation with the king as the little king that's running around being a little boy that I know of anyway, that is like truly depicted that way, is the original animated Disney Alice. He's a minor character, but I always go back to me sitting and watching the giant Red Queen and him like being 2 feet tall, running around with his giant scepter. But I think if we have to say my favorite adaptation I have ever come across, it's probably the musical I was in.
Oh, that's so special.
Yeah, yeah, it was really cool. It was really, really cool. It was cool to be the Cheshire Cat.
Yeah, oh my gosh. In talking about it, and especially the Burton one, the episode that is coming out next is a movie episode on Return to Oz, and those are now feeling so similar.
Yeah, if you ever want to do a Burton episode about Alice, let me know. I'll get on. We can totally do it. Because there's some cool, especially now that you've read it, you might appreciate it more.
Jess and I met on Welcome to Flatch season 2, and there is a new Descendants movie that just came out that was directed by Kimmy Gatewood, who we worked with. I had a big episode in season 2, and she really held my hand through it. And that is all in Wonderland, and I got to see it in theaters last weekend. She was kind enough to invite me.
So cool.
It's really, really, and I think she had a lot of it was practical effects. And I, even if you've never, it's Descendants 5 or something, but it's a really fun time. I cried during one of the songs. It's quite sweet.
Oh, that's exciting. That's terribly exciting.
But I have a question about, within the adaptations, the character that people seem to, because my main access point is this Looking Glass Wars book series. People make so much of the Hatter character. Why do you think that is? Because he's not really in there a ton.
I've always been super curious about this. I assume that a large chunk of it comes from him having such a memorable line in Why is a Raven Like a Writing Desk?
Right.
But to your point, I find it so interesting that if you go back and you watch the animated adaptation from Disney, most of the March Hare's lines are given to the Hatter.
Interesting.
And we go to the Hatter's house. We don't go to the March Hare's house. Like, I don't know if it's because he's one of the other humans. I don't know if it's because a Hatter is easier to depict than what a March Hare would be.
Right.
But I've always found that to be really interesting also, because it's clear that forever, basically, people have been pushing the Hatter to have more importance.
Yeah.
I mean, to the point of, like, the Burton adaptations, he is hands down the secondary character.
Yeah, he's probably second on the call sheet, yeah.
I would assume. And of course, that's Johnny Depp, so maybe that's just, a part of the fact that it's Johnny Depp working with Burton. But I don't think it is. You can maybe make that argument for Through the Looking Glass, which is just about the Hatter, really.
Right. Oh, yeah.
His adaptation of it,
right.
Anyway.
Okay.
But I found it even interesting how much the story revolved around the Hatter for Burton's adaptation. And it's clear that the Hatter is supposed to represent Alice's father in that adaptation. So, again, her kind of finding that connection in someone after losing her dad, I give it a pass, I'm like, okay, I understand what you're trying to do here. But I've always found it really odd. I think that a lot of people really find themselves drawn to his madness, but that always also catches me off guard, because it's not like he's alone in that trio. Like, it is a trio. And I personally love the March Hare and the Dormouse. I'm glad that they got, some chance to shine in some of the other adaptations. But yeah, I don't exactly know.
Yeah.
I also realized I might have lied a little bit. My favorite adaptation of Alice in Wonderland is actually probably the video game.
Oh, say so much. Which one?
It's so dark.
And this is not like Kingdom Hearts, right?
No.
Okay.
So it's called Alice Madness Returns. I also like the original. There's two. It's Alice Madness Returns is my favorite of the two. It's also the more modern of the two. It came out in 2000, I think. Might be a little bit after that, but I think it's around there. But it's by America McGee, and basically it's this dark horror action adventure game where Alice is in an asylum and
Very Return to Oz. Yeah.
Yes. And she has to go back into Wonderland to process her trauma. And so, like, the Wonderland that she goes to is, like, deteriorating and decrepit. And, like, the Cheshire Cat is this, like, skinny, hairless cat with still, signature giant smile. The Mad Hatter is, like, made into all of these, he's, like, giant, but he's, like, made into all of these, like, pieces. He's almost like a marionette puppet that's staying alive with like these cogs and all of these different bits and bobs. And basically it's all about it takes place between Wonderland and also the real world briefly here and there, where we find out that like something really bad happened to Alice and that's what she has to now overcome. And it's not a super true to form at all adaptation, but I think that that's what most people want to get from the text, is like some amount of like, is this about insanity? Is this about like losing yourself and losing your mind? Is
this meaning
about trauma? Like, what is this about? And I think that for a lot of people who are looking for a grander story that still feels very Alice and still is giving them all of those like pieces, America McGee's Alice hits the nail on the head for it.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
I think the big thing for me that I would definitely want to dive into is that last, like, page or two. Because I think, for me, I was like, oh, we're getting, like, a theme. We're getting, like, a moral. And her sister steps back in. And because I think with a story like this, with Wizard of Oz, with sort of gritty retellings and things like that, the important question to me is always, like, what happens to this poor girl afterwards? And there's a very, very hopeful, beautiful ending that really engages, I think, with this. There's this ongoing question that's very meaty that you were saying of like, am I myself but not myself? Am I someone new? Has so much time passed or so little time passed that I think feels very true to childhood, of this sort of amorphous, what do I even want to be? What am I seen as?
Am I? Yeah. I love that moment where we get the sister sitting down and returning to Wonderland herself in an almost daydreamy way. And I think that really is this beautiful, like, nod to the fact that we all can return to that childlike wonder, if so we're willing. And specifically that childlike wonder being so much more accessible to us when we are interacting with children and listening to children and hearing children. And I think that, again, I think that moment even for me wraps back around to what I was saying earlier about this idea of feeling understood in this unknown, nonsensical, childlike bliss that Lewis Carroll was really embodying when he was telling these stories. Is that like when you sit down with the children and you like let yourself go back to Wonderland, it's not so far away. I really love the quote. It's not from this text. I believe it's Through the Looking Glass, where it is in the adaptation, the Burton adaptation. Sometimes I believe as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast.
Yeah, that's a big one. That's a big one.
And that, I think, is also very embodying, right? Of like, if you just allow yourself to believe in the impossible, so many more things become possible.
There's a line that reminded me of that very early on, I think, as she's falling in, that I'm looking to find right now. But yes.
Yeah, there is something similar. But yeah, there's so much in this idea. Also the idea of eating and drinking being the thing that makes you grow and shrink and make you feel different and dizzy.
Eat your vegetables.
Yeah. Yep. Eat your vegetables. Don't drink the wine. All of like the very tiny nods to, like, again, almost cautionary children things. Like, and so much of the text really drudges up those feelings of childhood and dreams. And, like, by making it a dream, it is, one, overcomable, but it also allows for things to flow in a way that most stories don't have allowance for. Like, so many characters appear and disappear. Rooms change without her leaving them. Falling down a rabbit hole and, going through a looking glass also are motifs in and of themselves, right? Like falling into a mirror or falling down a rabbit hole and like losing yourself in these spaces that are backwards or unknown or upside down. Because that's obviously like, right, the mirror motif is backwardsness. And to fall down a rabbit hole is she even muses about maybe I'll come out on the other side where people are walking upside down, you know? And so these like ideas of just like turning things on their head or looking at them a different way is also so prevalent in the text. And really, I think, asks us as readers to question why is it nonsense versus what is real. And if we suspend our disbelief to allow all of it to be real and allow for this idea of there is a griffin who's just like sleeping here, and there's a turtle who used to be a turtle, but he's not a turtle anymore because some sort of magic made him not a turtle. And there was a baby, but the baby turned into a pig. And it's like, what is that beyond, the nonsense of it all? And I think that's where, people are searching for meaning while forgetting that you have to look at it through the lens of a child. Like, if you want to apply logic, it has to be childlike logic.
There's a great, it's on the 7th page of my copy, but so many out-of-the-way things had happened lately that Alice had begun to think that very few things indeed were really impossible. That feels like a very, a sibling of the one in Through the Looking Glass that you brought up.
A very, very similar idea of just like, well, what are we surmounting as impossible? Especially for a child, where everything really does feel limitless and filled with possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
If you, and I say this more as the outward you of any listeners out there, but also if you, Erin, would like the Burton soundtrack.
Oh.
Has Your Old Father William, it has the Lobster Quadrille, and they're turned into songs. So the poems are literally sung and put over some very quirky music. I find that album to be so much fun because none of those songs are in the movie, but they made a whole soundtrack that has nods to songs and moments and lessons that Alice is doing. Also, in that same vein, we didn't talk much about the hookah smoking caterpillar.
True.
But I find it interesting that he also puts so much into the who are you, And Alice, goes on to be like, well, I don't very well know, I could be anybody. And he's like, I don't know. That's what so many people want, is that who are you? And for a child, that is an insurmountable question. Because you don't know. You don't know, especially when you're, she's like 6.
Yes, very young,
like,
yeah.
She's a baby, basically. So, like, this idea of just growing up so fast and this unwillingness to do it. This story that tells you that that's not the thing that you need to do. You can hang on to that childlike wonder. And I think that so much of the book urges people to ask, who are you? And is that really you? Or is that the you that you have created for the world that you're in to, navigate and survive like Alice is doing?
Yeah.
Where she's stifling her words or trying to make sure she says the right thing. And, oh, well, I shouldn't say that. It's going to upset people. Everybody's so upset down here all the time. And I think it asks you and challenges you to be like, are you being earnest and honest with yourself? And do you even know who you are?
Yeah.
And I think that more adults could stand to ask that question.
Yeah. that the you at breakfast can be different from the you at lunch, and it's okay
100%.
to be in that conversation. What struck me that I had forgotten about until just this moment is there are some passages, especially early on, where Alice is really, really beating herself up about crying or something, and that really spoke to me and startled me, and I was, in a way, very glad to see. Yeah.
Yeah. This idea of, like, well, what's the worth of crying? Which, again, that urgency is taken away from her in the adaptation. They don't add many characters in the Disney animated movie. So much so that they even have Bill the Lizard. Bill the Lizard is in that movie.
I forgot that.
He's there, he does the chimney sweep, he gets shot through the chimney. That's all a part of that movie. But they take away her self-flagellation by creating he's a doorknob. He's like a doorknob character.
I was waiting for that to come up.
Crying. Yeah, no, doesn't exist. Not a real character. But they needed someone to still basically talk down to her in that moment and be like, there's no use in crying. So instead of having her do it to herself, which again I have to assume was because they felt like it was too either self-aware or too mean-spirited, because she is hard on herself. And maybe they just didn't want to model that for children, that idea of it's okay, like, no, it really is okay to cry, don't beat yourself up over it.
Or even just externalizing the internal, I think, is a thing that happens a lot in adaptations.
Which also could totally be it. That's obviously also very true and pertinent, because she speaks a lot of her lines that are said to be internal, externally in that movie. But I do find it so interesting that, like, that's really the only character I can pull out of my brain that they added. There's numerous that they deleted. But obviously, like I said, there's no Duchess, there's no Pig, there's no Cook. But, like, the fact that they were very, very deliberate in creating this singular character. The only other ones I can think that they really do that with is the Walrus and the Carpenter, which, again, is less of a intentional brand new character, here you go, and more of a, like, this is from a different text, and we're gonna implant it here, because why not? Because of whatever moral they wanted to teach. Yeah.
Is that Through the Looking Glass?
Yes. And so I always have found that to be also a very interesting thing that they chose to do. Because, like, there's lines that are moved around. There's, like, Alice does the busy bee, which is the crocodile. Why does the little crocodile? Which in the adaptation is from the hookah smoking caterpillar. I always have that image of him, like, blowing out smoke and it creating the alligator as he's, like, saying it. And so that I always expect is them moving stuff around or having different people say different things. But I always have gotten stuck on that just super interesting choice to be like, we still need her to be told to stop crying. Somebody has to talk down to her. So let's make a door handle. And I love him. I think he's a hilarious character. I'm so glad he's there. I very much appreciate him every time he comes on screen when I'm rewatching the movie. But I always find it funny because somewhere in the back of my head, I'm like, they just couldn't let her be mean to herself. She couldn't talk to herself and be like, stop crying, Alice. You're causing a dreadful flood. Like, no.
It feels like it goes without saying. Would you consider it required reading?
Yes, I definitely do. I think not enough people have read this book, especially for how short it is. It is such a crime. I'm like, it will take you a day. It will take you a day. Yeah, if you haven't gone and read Alice in Wonderland, and if your only understanding of it is through adaptations, I highly, highly recommend going and picking it up. It is a quick read. It is an enjoyable read. It has very, very short chapters. So if you don't want to read it in one sitting, you're really only bound to like 5 pages at a time. Like, it's a great, great book to go pick up, especially if you just want to have something that reminds you that childlike wonder still exists in the world.
Hell yeah. And then, where would you like to be found? Where can people find you?
You can find me on Instagram as Cheshire Theory, and that's probably the main spot you can find me right now.
Amazing. And since you were last on, I've added a new ending, which is I read the last sentence, paragraph or so of the book. And this is a good one, a very meaty one. So, lastly, she pictured to herself how this same little sister of hers would, in the after time, be herself a grown woman, and how she would keep, through all her riper years, the simple and loving heart of her childhood, and how she would gather about her other little children, and make their eyes bright and eager with many a strange tale, perhaps even the dream of Wonderland of long ago, and how she would feel with all their simple sorrows, and find a pleasure in all their simple joys, remembering her own child life and the happy summer days. The end. That says it all.